Welcome to episode 48 of Successful Demo. Each episode and analyze the theory and practical aspects of one release cards. Today we'll be looking at the new Jinteki Identity from Compiler Ascendant, Mti Mwekundu. Now, let's get this out of the way first thing, because I had the same misconception. The name of this ID is not MTI. It's not an acronym, it's not an initialism. Mti is Swahili for tree and Mwekundu is Swahili for red. Put together, that means red tree. Got it? Alright, that's good. Now, let's talk about this identity and how similar it is to Egg Infusion in the sense that the designers have been really pushing the power level of these Jinteki IDs. It seems like now, it's basically mandatory to be running a certain current against these IDs because and at the process, not running other most wanted list cards. Yeah, I'm sure many of you will know what I'm talking about. But anyway, Egg Infusion and Mti Mwekundu are very powerful. It's so powerful, in fact, that you probably want to run Employee Strike to counter them, because otherwise they have very punishing effects. Egg Infusion has the ability to boop you, which triggers when you run into any unrest ice on the table at all. And the punishment is you now have to face check a res outer ice. This is usually something you don't want to do, especially if said ice is a Chiyashi or DNA tracker. Mti Mwekundu, on the other hand, has a very common trigger as well. Just like running into unrest ice is very common. With Mti, it can trigger anytime the runner decides to run into servers with no ice, and that's a lot of times. The punishment for running to a server with no ice is that you are forced into face checking an ice that the corp decides to install from HQ and res. So that is a very dangerous prospect, because out of nowhere they can spring a surprise Chiyashi or DNA tracker on you and you can't jack out. So Mti Mwekundu forces you to actually encounter the ice if there are no other ice on the server, if you haven't encountered an ice, or rather if you haven't approached an ice on this run. If there is already existing ice on the server, then you do have a window to jack out before the corp gets to res the ice. So that's a very subtle detail to keep in mind as we move on to talk about Mti Mwekundu's important characteristics. Now, the first thing that I think glances off most people's minds is that Mti Mwekundu not only is a very painful face check, provides for painful face checks, but it also saves resources. Every time you get an Mti Mwekundu trigger, you are saving one click to install the ice in question, and you even save on the install cost as well. Because you're installing it in the innermost position, you're not paying the usual install cost, which is the number of existing ice on the remote or the central. So that's a lot of savings. Every turn you potentially can save a click and a few credits. That's a huge deal. The next thing is that it protects key assets and agendas early. This is an ability that a few other Jinteki IDs provide. Industrial genomics comes into mind, but even that can be turned off by running into archives and needs some time to charge up. Mti Mwekundu, on the other hand, works right out of the gate on turn 1. The runner has to respect any possible ice that can come out of you, and generally runners don't have a way to set up the breakers all on turn 1, so they're basically forced to concede whatever's on the board on turn 1, and this means you can run high impact assets like Rashida Jahim, which snowballs you out of control, because the runner just simply cannot afford to face check into something like a Cortex lock or a DNA tracker early. The corp also gains the initiative on gear checks, because the corp gets to choose which ice they want to install during the run, whereas all other corps have to play by the normal rule that the ice has to be installed first before the runner decides what breaker they want to get. Mti Mwekundu flips this on its head and now gets to choose the ice, which is very crucial when you're up against non-AI runners. So if the runner has a paperclip in the bin and an MK Ultra installed, for example, you as the corp can choose to install the code gate, the Enigma, in your hand, instead of something like a Vanilla for the barrier or a Cortex lock for the sentry. And yeah, just stop them dead cold. You can pick the correct subtype of the ice during the run, which is so cool and a very powerful ability. If you thought self-modifying code was good for Shaper, well, this is kind of the equivalent in Mti Mwekundu. Of course, you need to have the ice in HQ, but if you do, it's a blessing. Now, the final detail here is quite subtle as well. Mti Mwekundu suddenly makes positional ice that much better, and I think this was the main design intent behind Mti. You suddenly cards like Inazuma, cards like I'm blanking on some of them, but there are lots of positional ice in the game that are just useless if they are the innermost piece of ice. Inazuma, for example, doesn't fire if it's the innermost, and Sandstorm is pretty useless if it's the outermost for the most part. The ability to install Sandstorm as the innermost piece of ice is really cool, as is the ability to install Inazuma as the innermost piece of ice in your early turns, and then follow up with an Mti install behind the Inazuma sometime later. Positional ice become a lot more playable in Mti, so Mti not only amplifies your ice, not only saves you resources, but also forces the runner into face checks. A lot of great benefits from this one identity. No wonder people want to play Employee Strike against it. This is the deck we're going to be playing today. Now, I've talked to some high-level competitive players, and a lot of them told me that Acid Spam is the best thing to play in Mti Mwekundu. But I'm not that kind of person, so we are just going to be playing a very standard deck. I mean, if I showed you this deck list before Kampala Ascendant, you would think that it's a Polana deck list, and you wouldn't be wrong. This looks very much like a standard Jinteki Glacier / Rush deck. However, there's some card choices in here that are counterintuitive, so I will go into detail into them right now, and how they synergize with Mti's ability. Firstly, Scarcity of Resources, I think, is a very important card to play in Mti Mwekundu, because Employee Strike, as I mentioned time and again, is simply Mti's Achilles heel. If you are playing Mti under Strike most of the time, you'd rather be playing Ag Infusion instead, because that ID has 17 influence. Employee Strike disabling Mti is a huge deal, because you lose out on so much of your efficiency and so much of your asset protection, which prevents you from snowballing into a victory. The inability to pick the correct ice to stop the runner against an agenda run is also very important in the mid game. So you really want Mti's ability to be up, and this means having Scarcity. Now, Scarcity will always be played as a countercurrent in my deck, and I know that you can't play Scarcity on the runner's turn, which is the biggest problem, because obviously a smart runner will play Employee Strike only on the turn that they plan to challenge your agenda in the remote. Well, with our deck, as you can see here, we have a lot of bluffs. We can jam NGO fronts and Rashidas in the remote. We even have Bio Vault, which is an advanceable card that can masquerade as a Nisei Mark II. If the runner mistakenly runs on one of these bluffs and expends their Employee Strike while doing so, on the follow-up turn, we can play Scarcity and then jam the next item in there, and they now no longer have the Employee Strike to deal with Mti's ability. So that's the idea behind having countercurrents at the ready against runners with Employee Strike. We basically spend as many turns as possible jamming stuff into the remote, force their Employee Strikes on the table so that we can counter their current. Right. Another card that's interesting with Mti Mwekundu is Hound for the same reason. In the event that we don't draw our own current, Hound is our consolation prize for getting Employee Struck. Simple as that. It's a very solid piece of end-the-run ice, cheap to res, high strength, 2 subroutines, and helps us deal with, shores up our weakest matchup. This is what I like. This is good deck building in my opinion. You know, a lot of people try to jam in a lot of win more combos in decks, when if you want consistency, if you want to win often, what you really need to do is to put in cards that show up your weakest matchups. As I said, Employee Strike is a big problem. Hound is a nice semi-counter to that, especially in our deck, since we are not really the net damage flavor of Jinteki. We are more rush behind end run ice, so having a sentry end run is very crucial. Again, it synergizes very well with Mti's ability to punish runners who only install their barriers and code gates. Now, of course, we are Jinteki, and we would much rather play a tempo-style net damage deck with Kakugos and DNA trackers with Obo Carters. The reason we are not doing that is because we are spending our restricted slot on ice instead. We are spending 9 influence on top of that, playing 3 copies of Fairchild 3. This is a very curious decision, but I think it makes a lot of sense because we want as many hard end-the-run subroutines as possible to prevent the runner from stealing our agendas in the remote. DNA Tracker doesn't stop the runner from stealing agendas, Fairchild 3 does. The hard end run set routine is very important, and it works with our defensive upgrade as well, Marcus Batty. Finally, the click ability on this Bioroid is fairly useless in it's not a downside in the context of Mti Mwekundu, because typically, as I said, a smart runner would play Employee Strike before running. But if they spend their first click playing Employee Strike, it means that they won't have enough clicks to click through Fairchild 3s when they run the remote. So Fairchild 3 will hold up because runners typically won't have the 3 clicks needed to get past it. Even in the mid to late game, when Fairchild 3 is res and the runner knows that they should click through it, they can't afford to do so, because by then you would probably have scored a Nisei Mark II. With that token, you can never click through Fairchild 3 because I can simply end the run when necessary. So yeah, a lot of these cards don't seem synergistic with Mti Mwekundu on first sight, but if you think about it a bit more, these cards, Fairchild 3, Hound, and Scarcity of Resources, make a lot of sense in this particular deck I'm playing. Oh, also, I forgot to mention, Fairchild 3, some of you might notice this, yeah, it is... I'm not gonna lie, it was very much inspired by Heinzel's Worlds deck from last year. Playing Fairchild 3 instead of Obo Carter and Jinteki was a very bold move, but it paid off for him, and I'm borrowing a bit of that as well. It's a very good idea, especially in Mti Mwekundu. I like this tech. Thanks, Heinzel. So, this is our deck, with a bit of inspiration here and there, and let's see if we can rush our way to 7 points. Alright, let's discuss our matchup and the opening hand that we have. We are up against Kit, which is actually not the matchup you want to see as Mti, simply because Kit's ability allows her to face check any outer ice that you can throw on uniced remotes pretty safely, converting them all into code gates. So we lose that bite that we have, forcing the runner to find one of each breaker before attempting to contest remotes. That being said, our opening hand is fairly decent. Even though we don't have an opening Rashida, Rashida is always the card you want to see in your opening hand, because it's so good when you play it turn 1 as Mti. But there are only 3 copies in our deck. We can't reliably find them every game, which is why we spend 2 influence on Daily Business Show. It is not as good as Rashida, but we'll take it. It does a lot of work and it sticks on the board, unlike Rashida, so it helps us out in the long run as well. A turn 1 Daily Business Show that the runner doesn't contest can go a long way towards ensuring our victory. Drawing us exactly the cards we need, be it the correct type of ice or the correct agenda, and burying cards that we don't need, especially the defensive agendas like Future Perfect, Philotic. Well, Philotic's not a defensive agenda, but we don't want to score it early. So if we draw any of those cards, better bury it at the bottom of R&D where it's unreachable than to leave it in hand for Kit to steal. So this is our opening turn. We play Hedge Fund, we play Daily Business Show, and we take a credit because our ice is expensive. We want to be able to res the Daily Business Show and force the runner into Fairchild 3 should they choose to run this turn, which they don't, wisely enough. Instead, our opponent reveals that they are on Liberated account, meaning that they are not playing Magnum Opus as economy. You wouldn't splash for Liberated if your economy is Magnum Opus. So very interesting deck choice by our opponent here. Now, this is the other reason why we play Daily Business Show. On the off chance we draw both Daily Business Show and Rashida, we are going to get the CTM effect, the Sensi effect, shall I say, where you just get absolutely phenomenal amounts of draw filtering and shaping your hand, which is exactly what happens here, as our opponent doesn't install breakers, instead choosing to set up their draw in economy. We draw 4, bury 1, we obviously bury the duplicate Future Perfect here, and our mandatory draw draws us into our 3rd Kakugo. So our draw basically dictates our game. We are going to be playing a net damage based game here, even though this deck wasn't really designed for it. We are going to have a Kakugo each on R&D and the remote, with the plan to Mti Mwekundu our last Kakugo onto the remote, so that every time Kit runs our remote, they'll be taking 2 net damage. This is not usually the plan for this deck. We don't run Obo Carters that can be protected by Kakugos, but since we drew this ice, that's what we're doing. Our opponent runs HQ last click. With a Gordian Blade out, they can break our Kakugo, so we are not going to install Kakugo on HQ. We would rather save it for R&D. The remote. They trashed the Marcus from our hand, Marcus Batty. So yeah, by this point, Daily Business Show and Rashida haven't drawn me the agenda I need to score. We have a very, very narrow scoring window against Kit. This is after they install their code gate breaker, but before they find the rest of their breakers. You have a very small window where you have 2 or 3 ice on your remote, where they can't afford to run because our opponents on Gordian Blade, they are not on Ngolo, so they can't run our remote and threaten to convert all the ice into code gates. So we can potentially score this agenda. Because I'm not too worried about my opponent having the correct Fractor or Killer. So this Nisei is basically ours for the taking, but our opponent makes the mistake of dirty laundering into HQ last click after using the Gordian Blade and Kit's ability on R&D. So by putting Kakugo on HQ here, I deny them their 5 dirty laundry credits, which is a huge deal. I said I wanted to save the Kakugo for the remote, but using Kakugo and Mti's ability to deny my opponent 5 credits from dirty laundry is a win in my books. So this is why Mti is very strong. It doesn't occur only on the first run each turn, and yeah, it allows you to just shut down your opponent's run events. My opponent wanted some money from laundry, they end up being poorer than they expected, and I get my Nisei scored. Very good for me. Now, I don't draw into any further agendas here that I want to score. In fact, I'm too poor to score agendas. I don't have money to res ice now that I spent money resing the Kakugos on centrals. So I'm gonna get some money with this NGO front here instead. Resing it here in case my opponent runs interdiction. I don't want to lose 8 credits from my opponent trashing an unres NGO. You notice last turn my opponent was farming turning wheel counters on centrals. This is obviously not ideal, but every click they spend getting a turning wheel counter is a click they're not spending setting up their money, setting up their breakers. They still need a proper barrier breaker to get past the well, no more Kakugo on my remote, but yeah, they need to set up the rest of their breakers. So I'm happy to just pop the NGO here and try to score this Nisei, install advanced, and then play IPO, only to realize that I can't play IPO. I'm 1 credit short. So, you know, with a bit of hand waving here, I take this move back. Awkward. Sorry about that. Yeah, it kind of gives away information, but I'm going to change the way I play, because normally I would play the IPO here, but if I'm not able to play the IPO on the turn I try to score the Nisei, I won't have money to defend the remote, so that's a no-go. So instead, we're just going to put the Nisei in the remote without advancing it, and then we take some money. Right, so we're going to score this Nisei 1 turn later than we would have liked, but, well, that's how it is. There's not much we can do about it. We need the money, and once we have the money, I think we are pretty safe to score this Nisei, because they need to make 2 successful runs on server 2. Because of our Nisei token, so we should be able to get this agenda past them. Now DBS draws us disgustingly into bacterial programming and Nisei, so I keep the duplicate Nisei in case somehow our opponent manages to run through server 2 twice. Click 1 is draw. Again, very disgustingly, I draw yet another agenda, so HQ is very flooded right now. Yeah, this was not the plan. This was not the plan at all. Right, I was trying to draw into money or some other form of ice so that I can bamboozle my opponent, because right now the remote is outermost Kakugo into a code gate, I believe. So my opponent doesn't need any other breakers to challenge my remote. Thankfully, they don't go for my remote at all. Instead, they are setting up the barrier breaker, in which case I'm going to score my second of 3 Niseis. This is going to make it relatively easy for me to score my final future perfect, if not for the fact that my opponent has set up a very solid economy. 18 credits to their name, so there's no way I can score any of these future perfects at this point. I'm too poor and they're too rich. So because of this, they have good money in their bank right now, but they don't have sustained economy. Remember, this kid is not running Magnum Opus, so if you can drain them out of their money by forcing them through the remote time and again, I think I can make a run for the money by scoring one of the final future perfects for the win. To do so, however, it means that I need to start jamming stuff into the remote. Thankfully, our opponent's making it easier on us as they keep running R&D here, taking net damage. So, you know, wasting some of their resources on single central runs. Important to note that they're on 5 turning wheel counters. I hope they don't spend it on HQ. If they do, I might be forced to spend some Nisei counters to counter them. Alright, so our remote is Kakugo into Fairchild 3. This is a trivial remote to get through for them, and it's very expensive for me to res. So I'm gonna think I need to put something in the remote right now. I need to force them to waste money because they have 10 credits and another 8 sitting on daily casts. It's time to drag them through the remote, and I think the best thing to bait them here with is actually my last Nisei. This is an agenda. I don't have any plans to score at all. I'd rather score a 3-pointer to win than a 2-pointer to gain a Nisei token at this point. And I'm kind of okay with them stealing it. They're on 0 agenda points, so losing 2 agenda points is not the end of the world. My opponent does in fact check server 2. I'm more than happy to see this. This means that I can tax them very hard as they start breaking the Kakugo with Gordian Blade. Taking 1 net damage, Fairchild 3 is going to be bloody expensive. That's 6 credits for Gordian to break. This is not sustainable for a runner without Magnum Opus. So now they're down to single digit credits, and I even get Mti Mwekundu to fire. Now, unfortunately, as much as I would have liked to install the Fairchild 3 there, unfortunately, against a Gordian Blade runner, stacked Fairchild 3s on remotes is not going to cut it, right? Their Gordian Blade retains the strength 5, so Gordian Blade slices through multiple Fairchild 3s very well. Instead, we're going to use Enigma here, a very solid base ice for Mti Mwekundu. They are forced to break both subroutines, and they can't usually run last click, because if they run last click, I can potentially threaten Nisei tokens on them. This entire affair put me down to 0 credits. Thankfully, Mti Mwekundu allows me to install the Enigma for free. I didn't have to pay the 2 credits or the click to install it on server 2. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to execute that, right? I'm too poor and I don't have enough clicks. But Mti's ability allowed me to install the Enigma on the remote, and now I have 3 eyes on the remote. It's a very tall ask for them to contest server 2 once again, right? Remember, they started this turn with excess of 12 credits or something, and they went all the way down just to run my remote. It cost them at least 8 credits between the Enigma and Fairchild 3. So obviously, they're not going to want to run server 2. Instead, they index me. You have no idea how happy I am to see this indexing. Don't forget, there are 5 agendas between my HQ and my score area, and I just buried one with Daily Business Show earlier on. I buried bacterial programming, I think. So actually, there are only 2 agendas that they can possibly see on top of R&D, so I wasn't surprised to see them whiff on R&D right here. Their indexing probably showed up nothing, because I was absolutely flooded when I drew cards early on. So because they whiffed on R&D, they swung over to the remote, which was arguably a mistake, because HQ was actually the right server. That's where all my agendas are, and you notice they do have the Film Critic. So any future perfect they hit, I can't defend against. They're definitely going to host it on Film Critic, or at the very least, force a side game on me when I'm poor. If they ran HQ, I would have been forced to pop Nisei tokens there. I can't afford to let them hit both my future perfects. So yeah, thank goodness they swung over to my remote, because this basically bankrupted them. And surprisingly, you'll notice here, I made a crazy play of using the Nisei token on a Rashida. There's a reason for this. The Rashida gives me the 3 credits I need to score the future perfect. Putting me at 5 credits, I can install double advance this turn and threaten the win next turn with a Nisei counter to protect it. And my opponent's poor. They only have 3 credits. I'm fairly sure they can't get the future perfect to win this game. This was why I was happy to use the Nisei token on a lowly Rashida. I needed the instant 3 credits to threaten the win this turn. I knew I needed to win fast, otherwise my opponent would get the money needed to contest my future perfects later on. Future perfect really not the ideal agenda. They don't defend themselves in the remote. So my opponent attempts to run my remote here on 3rd click because of Nisei token. Unfortunately, their maths was a bit off. They realized they can't actually get all the way through my remote. They break a bunch of subroutines on Fairchild 3, and then whoop, no money left. Yeah, so they were forced to jack out there, which means that I basically win the game off the rushing strategy. Not that it would have mattered if I don't think they actually had the resources to contest my remote twice against the Nisei token. They needed a stim hack for that, and they still needed to survive all the damage from Kakugo and stim hack, so I think they were kind of locked out there. I was simply too fast, too furious for them to handle. And a lot of that efficiency can be attributed to my ID ability, because my opponent was running Film Critic instead of Employee Strike. I got free reign with Mti Mwekundu, and I was able make a lot of work out of this ID ability. Not only did it save me resources on installing ice as I anticipated, but it had the effect of denying my opponent's credits. This was something that I didn't really expect coming into this matchup. Because I'm not really using a lot of tempo ice like Cortex Lock, Komainu, which really slow down the runner a lot by sniping cards from the hand. Since I'm not using that, I'm using mostly end the run ice. I wasn't expecting my ice to serve as denial for my opponent, but it did. It turns out that a lot of runners are relying on Dirty Laundry for economy, because runner economy is not in a good position right now. And you can't really fire Dirty Laundry against Mti Mwekundu, turns out. So denying the Dirty Laundry from my opponent with the Kakugo HQ install was a huge deal. Not only did deny them 5 credits, but I also protected my HQ from subsequent runs, which was a huge factor. Because I had a lot of future perfects in my hand against their film critic. Mti Mwekundu installing Enigma was what won me the game in my opinion. They made 2 successful runs on server 2, which cost them 4 extra credits, breaking the Enigma twice. That is a lot of tax for a 3 to res ice that costs no clicks to install. Not to mention that on the final turn when they attempted to go for my future perfect, they realized they didn't have enough credits to break the end the run on the final Enigma. Without that Enigma in the innermost position, I would not have been able to score that future perfect that safely. So Mti Mwekundu really providing the swing needed for me to safely score the agenda and to provide the commanding victory. Otherwise, scoring that future perfect would have looked a lot more dicey. Now, as with most other decks that rely on early assets like Rashidas and daily business shows to snowball forth, they can be weak early game. But the thing is, the runner doesn't know this. To the runner, they are always afraid of the Cortex Lock or DNA Tracker in the corpse opening hand, even though they might just not have it. And that's the real power of Mti Mwekundu. You know, the amount of fangs that it can threaten, even though it might be a toothless dragon, so as to speak. And I think this is the single point that runners need to internalize when they face up against Mti Mwekundu. I hear a lot of people say that Mti is too strong to handle without Employee Strike, which might be true, but if you are a player playing Employee Strike and you just don't have it in your opening hand, I think it's important to keep in mind that Mti Mwekundu can sometimes be very weak in the opening. Let me show you a couple of snapshots from this game which proves my point. This was my board state turn 3. To the runner, this looks really scary. There's a lot of scary ice out there on the board, and the corp might have something really nasty in hand, something like Komainu or Cortex Lock against Kit, which has no breakers installed. But if you look at my hand, this is a perfect HQ to run on and cripple the corp with. If they hit my Rashida, I would not have been able to accelerate my game, would not have been able to get the Rashida daily business show combo off. If they hit the future perfect, they steal it with film critic. If they hit the Marcus Batty, that's one less defensive upgrade I have. Kit running HQ here would have been the best play for them, because I couldn't threaten with any painful ice. All I had was a lowly Kakugo, which simply ends the run. So in this situation, the ideal play for Kit would have been to run HQ, but how can they know that, right? But that's exactly my point. Sometimes you just need to play very aggressively against Mti, because sometimes they just don't have it in hand. They don't have the ice that can cripple you. And same thing when we move on one turn to turn 4. This was the turn where the Dirty Laundry into R&D wasted their kit, or not wasted, rather expended their kit ability and then attempted to Dirty Laundry HQ only to get stopped by the Kakugo. Had they Dirty Laundry into HQ instead of R&D here, wouldn't that have been amazing? There were 4 cards in my hand, 3 of which would have been important for them to hit. And, you know, if I use Kakugo to defend HQ here, no matter which card they hit, Kit comes out way ahead. If they hit my Rashida, it slows down my game by 1 or 2 turns. If they hit my NGO front, they deny me 6 credits rather. And if they hit my future perfect, they are now 3 agenda points up. Had they Dirty Laundry into HQ instead of R&D, I think this would have been a very different game. This was a very crucial turn, because my hand was so full of good stuff. A Dirty Laundry into HQ would have set me very far back. Instead, they ran R&D, which turned out short, and I was able to use the 3 cards in my hand to good advantage later on. And then we came to the late game, turn 10. This was after they used Mti's ability to run the remote, and forcing me to Mti install the Enigma on the remote. They had 2 clicks left. They could siege either HQ or R&D. As I mentioned in the video, had they chose to run HQ here and expand a couple of turning wheel counters, I would have been forced to use a Nisei counter to counter them. And that would have clued them in. They might have ran HQ again, and, you know, sniping the Rashida or either of the 2 future perfects from my hand would have done a lot of work, bring them to match point and or slowing down my score, because as you saw from the game, it turned out that the 3 credits from Rashida were very vital in helping me to score the future perfect efficiently and quickly. So yeah, a lot of juicy targets in hand for most of the game, but my opponent focused a bit too much on R&D and the remote. So it's a very high skill cap playing against Mti, don't get me wrong. There's lots of threats that Mti can pose at you, and sometimes it's very difficult to figure out when is a good time to run HQ. Had they ran on other turns outside of those 3 snapshots that I showed, they could have ran into a Fairchild 3, which would have crippled them as well. But the point is this. I think when you play games against Mti Mwekundu, inevitably there will be those 1 or 2 games where you attempt to play aggressively, or you know, you try to do so after listening to what I'm saying in this video, only to get hit by that Cortex lock or DNA tracker, and you're just like a laboratory rat that just got zapped by an electric shock. You're like, ugh, negative feedback, I'll never do that again. That was bad, that felt bad, that was a blowout, etc. But this is not the right way to go, I think, because for every game where you get electric shocked, there will be another game where running aggressively is the correct choice, where running aggressively was one of the reasons why you eventually won the game. You know, had my opponent ran aggressively against HQ, there's a good chance they would have won, because they would have denied key assets or agendas from me. So I think the important thing, bottom line, is this: try playing aggressively more often. Try not to remember all those times where you got blown out by those nasty face check ice, because you know, don't treat them as an electric collar. In fact, because it's very easy to overlook the positive reinforcement from, you know, denying a key asset or agenda that the court needed to win the game. Those positive feedbacks are not something that's easily observable, whereas something like a DNA tracker blowout is very easily observable and will make you play a lot more passively, which in my opinion is suboptimal. As you saw from this game, my opponent played too passively, allowing me to score 2 Niseis, which basically locked up the game. Right, with all that out of the way, let's talk about the usual combos and Nonbos. We've talked about a lot about combos in the opening slides, but here's another one that I briefly mentioned in the Surveyor successful demo video as well. Ice that scale with the number of ice in the server synergize very well with Mti Mwekundu, because Mti allows you to install these ice for free, buffering up your server, making these ice that much more powerful. These are very reasonable includes in an Mti Glacier deck. What isn't a justifiable include, however, is the Jinja City Grid that you usually play with Surveyor and Seder Barrier. Even though you do want to be stacking the ice high, Jinja Grid is a Nonbo with Mti for the simple reason that as Mti Mwekundu, you want to have ice in your hand, and Jinja City Grid actively takes away ice from your hand, which is not good. So yeah, you don't want to be playing Jinja Grid in Mti Mwekundu. If you're looking to play a Glacier deck with Jinja and Jinteki, which is perfectly fine, go look for Aghan Fusion, go look for Palana. This isn't the home for it. Another important Nonbo to note is Commercial Bankers Group, which was what I experimented with when I first tried to make an Mti Mwekundu deck. Political assets can be powerful, however, they are really win more cards against opponents who misplay by playing too passively. Again, as I mentioned, suboptimal players will play very passively against Mti, which allows your political assets to snowball out of control. But a good player will contest these assets very actively, and you'll find that these assets are basically worthless, dead influence spends or dead MWL expenditures, because they just don't get to fire. Every time your opponent runs on it, you're forced to turn it off, either by the runner trashing it for cheap, or by installing an ice over your bankers group, which deactivates it. So obviously some of you might be saying, well, you can play those trashable ice, trap ice like Imore and Sadaka, which allow your ice to fire, yet your political asset stays active, which is true. However, what I find with these trashable ice is that while they do keep your political assets alive, they don't help you set up your board state, because the runner will simply still run through the server successfully. These trap ice don't end the run and trash your bankers group. So you're not setting up. In fact, you've spent tempo to res your trap ice and now you're further behind. So I don't think political assets are very good in Mti Mwekundu unless they print more trap ice that are more powerful, I guess, which, as we know, is probably not going to happen. So that's basically it. Mti Mwekundu, a very powerful ID ability, but something that you can easily play around if you put a bit more effort into ignoring those blowout moments with nasty ice. Hopefully this has taught you a bit about the weaknesses of Mti as well. I never realized it myself, but after playing it a bit, I can see that there are inroads for runners who run your HQ more often, and I'll be trying to run HQ more often myself if I play a runner against Mti. Well, that's all. Hope you learned something. Thanks for watching and happy net running. Goodbye.